It's the 12th of August 1944. A young man sits in the tight cockpit of a North American P-51D Mustang, the most beautiful fighter aircraft ever built. His name is James Ragsdale McCutcheon. He's 20 years old. He's been in England for 9 days. Below him, somewhere in German-occupied France, are railroad yards full of enemy locomotives and fuel cars, targets that need to die. He pushes his throttle forward, feels the Merlin engine roar to life with a sound like fury, and dives toward Earth at speeds that few humans have ever survived. What happens next will echo through his family for 80 years, and it will take a great-nephew's journey across an ocean to finally understand how a Texas boy became a legend in a town that had never heard of him. This is the story of the 55th Fighter Group, the Loco Busters, and the last moments of a replacement pilot who wanted to prove he belonged among the best fighter pilots in the world. Part 1. The Mustang Revolution. To understand Jim McCutcheon, you have to understand the machine he flew. The North American P-51 Mustang wasn't supposed to exist. It was born by accident, a marriage of American ambition and British desperation that created a weapon of such perfect elegance, such devastating efficiency, that it would change the entire air war over Europe. In 1940, with Britain fighting for survival against Nazi Germany, the Royal Air Force desperately needed fighters. They asked North American Aviation to manufacture the Curtiss P-40 under license. But North American's president, a West Virginian named Dutch Kindleberger, had other ideas. He proposed building something entirely new, a fighter that would combine American mass production techniques with a sleek, aerodynamic design. The British agreed. They had nothing to lose. The prototype flew in October 1941. It was beautiful. Low-drag fuselage, laminar flow wing, a shape that seemed to slip through air rather than push through it. But there was a problem. The Allison engine that powered it couldn't perform at high altitude. A British test pilot had an idea. What if you gave it a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine? The engine that had made the Spitfire a legend? They tried it, and the world changed. The P-51B arrived in England in late 1943, and by early 1944, every Allied fighter commander understood what they were looking at. A fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. A fighter that could turn, climb, and fight at any altitude. A fighter with a range so vast that it could hunt enemy fighters anywhere over Nazi Germany. A fighter so superior to everything else flying that one German commander, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, would later say, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." The Mustang had 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns. It could carry 2 500-pound bombs. It could reach 440 miles per hour. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was the difference between winning and losing the air war over Europe. And the 55th Fighter Group had just converted to them in July 1944. Part 2. The 55th Fighter Group. The 55th Fighter Group had arrived in England in September 1943 as the first P-38 Lightning Group attached to the 8th Air Force. They flew twin-engine fighters, sleek and powerful machines that excelled at reconnaissance and high-altitude performance. But the P-38 was heavy, temperamental, and had limited range. When the decision came down to convert to Mustangs, the pilots weren't entirely convinced. Some loved their P-38 seconds. But once they strapped into a Mustang, most of them understood. This was a new age of air combat. The 55th was based at Station 159, Wormingford, in Essex, England. 3 squadrons, the 38th, the 338th, and the 343rd Fighter Squadrons. Their identification mark was a distinctive green and yellow checkerboard pattern painted on their engine cowlings, a design chosen because it was visible from great distances and impossible to mistake for German markings. Their mission was twofold. First, they escorted the massive formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers that thundered across the English Channel toward German industrial targets. The bombers flew in tight formations at high altitude, slow and vulnerable to enemy fighters. The Mustangs weaved around and above them, hunting for Luftwaffe interceptors. This was dangerous work. German fighters attacked the bombers with discipline and desperation. The 55th pilots had to be faster, more aggressive, and more accurate. But as the war progressed and the Luftwaffe's fighter force dwindled, the 55th's mission changed. Instead of just escorting bombers to their targets and back, they began flying what they called railroad rodeos, dangerous, low-level strafing missions over occupied France and Germany. These missions targeted the lifeblood of Nazi military logistics: locomotives, railroad yards, fuel cars, ammunition trains, troop transports. The term railroad rodeo was pure American frontier slang, a shoot 'em up Western term that captured the wild, aggressive nature of what they were doing. Dive from altitude, drop bombs, level off at a few hundred feet, and strafe with all 6 machine guns blazing. It was deadly work. Flak from anti-aircraft guns was terrifying at low level. The Germans could see you coming. They had time to aim. And if you got hit, if even one round penetrated the Mustang's liquid-cooled Merlin engine, you were going down. The P-51's engine was beautiful, powerful, fuel-efficient, and utterly vulnerable to small arms fire. The German P-47 Thunderbolt, with its air-cooled radial engine, could shrug off bullets. The Mustang could not. But the 55th pursued these missions with such ferocity, such success, that they earned an informal nickname across the 8th Air Force: the Loco Busters. They destroyed more locomotives than any other fighter group in the entire command. They were awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation for their work. They were the best at what they did. And they had a nickname that perfectly captured their mentality. If a target moved on rails, it was going down. In 1944, pilot losses in the 55th were estimated to be above 50%. Every mission you flew, you had roughly a 1 in 2 chance of not coming home. Those odds would have terrified rational men. But fighter pilots were a specific kind of human, young, trained, confident, convinced that they would be the ones who made it back. Part 3. Jim McCutcheon before. James Ragsdale McCutcheon was born on the 13th of September, 1923, in Fort Davis, Texas, far west in the desert, near the Mexican border. His parents, Bennett and Celeste, owned a large ranch. Jim was the youngest of 5 children. He grew up in an age when flying was still a wonder, when few people had ever seen an airplane, and fewer still had ever been inside one. But Jim was captivated. As a child, he built and flew balsa wood model airplanes. Every boy built model planes in those days, but Jim was different. His family remembered him as capable, strong, sometimes opinionated, even as a child. He knew what he wanted. He was very tall for his time, over 6 feet, even as a teenager. In a world where average height was closer to 5'8", Jim's height made him stand out. It marked him as different. Then tragedy struck. In 1939, when Jim was 16, his mother died. The following year, his father passed away. At 16 years old, Jim was an orphan. He moved to Victoria, Texas, to live with his uncle, Jim W. Ragsdale. After high school, he attended Texas A&M University in College Station. But the pull of the war and the sky was too strong. He left college to enlist in the United States Army Air Force. Pilot training was brutal. Of every 100 men who started, maybe 30 would earn their wings. The screening was savage, the training unforgiving. Early morning flights to test your nerve, navigation exercises to test your judgment, combat maneuvers to test your reflexes and your courage. Jim McCutcheon made it through. By 1944, he was a second lieutenant with the insignia of a fighter pilot, and he had been assigned to fly the P-51D Mustang, the deadliest fighter in the world. In August 1944, Jim was ordered to England. He was a replacement pilot, fresh from training, assigned to the 55th Fighter Group, 338th Fighter Squadron, at Wormingford. On the 3rd of August 1944, he arrived at the base. His fellow pilots took one look at his height, 6 feet 1 inch, and immediately gave him a nickname: Big Stoop. because he had to stoop to fit under the canopy of his aircraft. Jim had just 9 days to adjust, to learn the layout of his base, to get to know the men he'd be flying with, to understand the rhythm of combat operations in the European theater. 9 days to become part of a unit that had already lost dozens of pilots. 9 days to prove himself to men who had seen friends die, who had seen the sky full of enemy fighters, who knew exactly how deadly this war really was. On the 12th of August 1944, Big Stoop McCutcheon would get his chance. Part 4. The Railroad Rodeo. The morning briefing was routine. 26 Mustangs from the 55th were going to fly a railroad rodeo near Metz, France, a strategic location in the occupied territories where German rail yards were full of locomotives and supply vehicles. The pilots studied the maps, marked their routes, discussed the expected flak. Some of the older hands had flown this route before. They knew what to expect: anti-aircraft guns, small arms fire from German troops, possibly enemy fighters if you were unlucky. Jim was assigned to fly as number 2 in the flight of Captain Lanoy D. Anderson, a veteran pilot with combat experience. Number 2 meant Jim would fly in formation on Anderson's wing, close enough to coordinate tactics, but loose enough to provide mutual protection. Jim's Mustang, tail number 44-13744, was loaded with 2 500-pound bombs and a full load of ammunition for his 6 machine guns. They took off from Wormingford, climbed to altitude, and crossed the English Channel. Behind them, the coast of England fell away. Ahead, the green landscape of occupied France lay flat and exposed under the August sun. They descended toward their target, the marshalling yard at Ars, southwest of Metz. The yard was perfect. 25 to 30 oil tank cars lined up on the rails. Mixed cargo, no doubt supplies for German forces fighting in Normandy. Anderson led the dive from 7,000 feet. Jim followed. They were moving fast now, gravity pulling them earthward, the Merlin engine singing at high revolutions. Below, the German anti-aircraft crews could hear them coming. The distinctive purr of a Merlin engine is not something that German troops forgot. They knew what it meant. Mustangs, American fighters, death coming from above. Anderson pulled his Mustang hard at 2,500 feet, broke sharply left and up, then back to the right. Standard evasive maneuver, make yourself hard to track. Jim followed down on the dive, but after Anderson's initial pass, Anderson and his wingman number 3 and 4 didn't see Jim again. What happened next remains a mystery. Captain Anderson reported in his official statement that he recovered from his dive, looked around for Jim, and didn't see him. He was not seen to crash in the vicinity of our target, Anderson wrote, and it was assumed that he finished bombing and started strafing targets of his own. That assumption was almost certainly correct. Jim McCutcheon, a replacement pilot with 9 days of experience, facing 50% pilot losses, probably saw those oil cars below him and made a decision that would kill him. His bombs were gone. His 6 machine guns still had ammunition. And ahead of him, somewhere near Revigny-sur-Ornain, was a target of opportunity locomotives, rail cars, German troops, supplies, everything a locobuster lived for. He leveled off low, probably a few hundred feet above the ground. He pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Merlin engine respond with all its 12 cylinders screaming. And he opened fire with all 6 machine guns. Tracer rounds reached out ahead of him. They should have scattered the Germans. They should have driven them to cover. But the Germans were ready. Anti-aircraft fire reached back up at him. The distinctive crack, crack, crack of flak. The bright orange tracers arcing upward. One of those rounds found the Mustang. Maybe it hit the radiator. Maybe it hit a coolant line. Whatever happened, the liquid-cooled Merlin engine was mortally wounded. It would not carry Jim McCutcheon back to England. Part 5. The Last Moment. His great-nephew, Dominic McCutcheon, would later write about what Jim's final moments might have been like, imagining that young Texas boy in his cockpit, realizing his engine was failing, watching the temperature gauges climb into the red, the Merlin, bleeding coolant, overheating, losing power, the ground, rushing up, the smoke, At 1:50 p.m., Jim McCutcheon's P-51D Mustang crashed 1 kilometer east of Revigny-sur-Ornain, near the railroad tracks by the woods. A sickening thump, one French witness would later recall, reverberating through the small town. The impact was catastrophic. A beautiful machine, 2 tons of aluminum and steel, moving at high velocity, meeting Earth. The pilot never had a chance. The Germans recovered Jim's body. It was badly broken. The French police who came to the crash site issued a death certificate. They recorded the identification bracelet found on his right wrist. Jim's body was wrapped in a mattress cover. A funeral was held at the town military cemetery, the American pilot buried alongside French soldiers and heroes. Flowers adorned his grave marker until the occupying German forces destroyed them too. Back at Wormingford, Jim's name went into the missing air crew report, number 07770. 20 years old, 9 days in theater. His fate was unknown. His family never knew what had happened to him. 73 years would pass before the truth surfaced. Part 6. The Search. In 2017, Dominic McCutcheon, Jim's great-nephew, decided to find out what had happened to his uncle. He gathered family documents, studied the war records, and made the journey to France. Armed with photocopied pictures of Jim standing in front of his Mustang, looking young and confident and handsome, Dominic drove to Revigny-sur-Ornain. It was a small town, with fewer than 3,000 residents. The odds of finding anyone who cared about an American pilot shot down 73 years ago seemed remote. But Dominic left pictures in mailboxes, under windshield wipers, and walked into a small cafe. What happened next was pure grace. A French woman who saw Dominic's pictures about Jim began to cry. She picked up her phone. Within moments, the town vice mayor arrived, then the mayor, then local historians. They brought out official documents, Jim's death certificate, his missing air crew report, a detailed account written by a French child who had witnessed the aftermath of the attack. In a town where the occupation had been hard, where German soldiers had been the enemy for 4 years, here was an American boy who had given his life trying to strike at German supply lines. A boy who had come to France as a replacement pilot and never went home. The town of Revigny-sur-Ornain had kept Jim's memory alive. They knew the significance of the 12th of August, 1944. They knew the sacrifice, and they honored it. On behalf of the town, Mayor Pierre Bourgain presented Dominic with a medal posthumously awarded to Second Lieutenant James Ragsdale McCutcheon for his sacrifice. It was a moment that transcended 73 years. In that room in the town hall, surrounded by French citizens who had never met Jim, who had never known his family, but who understood the weight of his sacrifice, Dominic McCutcheon felt his great-uncle's presence. Jim was home, not in Texas, but in the town where he fell, the town that had never forgotten him. Closing reflection. The 55th Fighter Group flew from Station 159 at Wormingford until April 1945. They destroyed 585 enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground during 18 months of combat. They had the highest strafing record in the 8th Air Force. They were awarded 2 Distinguished Unit citations. 181 pilots were missing in action, gone without a trace. Their bodies never recovered, their fates sometimes unknown. Jim McCutcheon was one of them for 73 years. The P-51 Mustang, the aircraft Jim loved and trusted, was the game-changing weapon of the air war over Europe. Hermann Göring didn't die in a bunker wondering if the Allies would win. He saw Mustangs over Berlin, and he knew the jig was up. But the Mustang was only as good as the pilot flying it, and the pilot was only as good as his courage, his training, his willingness to face 50% odds and fly anyway. Jim McCutcheon had 9 days of courage. On the 9th day, he made the choice that all loco-busters made. He saw a target of opportunity, and he attacked. He knew the risks. He flew anyway. He never made it home, but not because he lacked skill or courage. He didn't make it home because that's what war does. It takes young men and gives them beautiful machines and asks them to do impossible things. Jim's grave sits in the Epinal American Cemetery in France, among thousands of other American soldiers who never made it back. But before he rested there, a small French town remembered him. A town that the Americans had helped liberate. A town that understood that sacrifice, wherever it comes from, deserves to be honored. 80 years later, the French still know the significance of the 12th of August 1944. And in Texas, the McCutcheon family knows it too.